you all to the Eastside Freedom Library. There are restrooms downstairs. There's an elevator if you find the stairs daunting. We are about 5.5 years old here, and this was a public library. I always like to tell people that as a Carnegie Library, this building was paid for by the sweat and blood and labor of immigrant miners and steel workers, and made Andrew Carnegie a rich man. And so I always like to thank the workers who actually paid for the building. We are a center for labor, immigration, and social justice history. I like to think of sort of everything that happens here leaves a little residue of spirit. So all day yesterday and from 8 o'clock till 12:30 today, 25 elementary school teachers were meeting downstairs, developing their restorative practices program for the elementary schools in place of punitive discipline. So we're sitting on their energy here right now. Tomorrow, as the first Sunday in the month, we have what we call Book Geek Story Hour. We invite people to come in and read whatever you're interested in reading at 4 o'clock. We read for about an hour and a half, and then have a little bit of conversation about what everybody's reading. So come back tomorrow. This is Orso the library dog. Hopefully nobody's allergic or threatened by the dog. He's a great presence here. So I was excited that these two were willing to come and speak together and speak to us. And what a good week to be talking about how to our political culture get into this situation. There's a lot obviously going on in Washington and elsewhere in the world as a result of what's been happening in Washington. So Scott Laderman teaches at University of Minnesota-Duluth, where he also happens to be president of the faculty union. And Scott has come through here on some union stuff as well as his interests in relatively recent American history. And Elaine May has been at the University of Minnesota for a while, and someone I've known for a long time. And I love the idea that Elaine was once Scott's teacher, now they're colleagues. This is what can happen in the world. And I mean, both of them have really honed their skill of looking at what we love to talk about here, the relationship between the present and the past. And in their case, it's been largely their recent past. But I think historical thinking is a very valuable skill. So Scott's going to talk first about his project and this most recent book in particular. I look around and most of us remember that term, the silent majority, and I think Scott's going to offer us something in addition to think about the silent majority, and then Elaine is going to talk a little bit, and then we'll have a conversation. Scott?
All right. Well, yeah, thank you, Peter, and we appreciate the invitation to be here today and to speak with all of you. And I have to say, for me, this is quite strange. Elaine was more than a teacher to me. She was my advisor and has been just a very dear friend over the years. And I've come down and spoken with Elaine's students in the past, but I've never actually spoken with Elaine at an event like this. And so it's intimidating as hell for me to be sitting up here with her, but also just a tremendous honor because, Elaine is one of the leading historians of the United States anywhere. She's a former president of the Organization of American Historians, former president of the American Studies Association. She's a big deal. And so it's really something to
See how well I taught him?
Yeah. To be with Elaine. What I thought I would do is I talk a little bit about a book that I just finished recently that I think is particularly timely at the moment, especially timely. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but tomorrow, November 3rd, will be the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's great rhetorical contributions to American political culture, and that is the silent majority. It was 50 years ago tomorrow that he introduced this term to the American public. And so what I thought I would do is say a little bit about the speech, what was covered in that speech, a little bit then about what Nixon meant by the silent majority, because this is a speech that was in fact about the Vietnam War. You know, the reference to the silent majority was a throwaway line at the tail end of a 32-minute speech, but it's one that obviously resonated considerably with the public. And then moving beyond Nixon, I thought I'd try to connect that idea to some later political figures, ultimately bringing it up to our current political moment with Donald Trump. Though I probably won't say too much, at least in these introductory comments about Trump. I have a feeling there might be one or two questions about that, and so maybe I'll leave it for that. So it was 50 years ago that Richard Nixon introduced this term to us, the silent majority. And this was, like I said, at the tail end of a speech that was devoted to the Vietnam War. Nixon had been in office less than a year at this point. He was elected in 1968, came into the White House January of 1969, and spent time trying to figure out what it was that he could do to pull the United States out of the morass into which it had stumbled is probably not the right word, but in which it found itself in Southeast Asia. And what he came up with was a plan that he called Vietnamisation. And what Vietnamisation meant, essentially, was that the United States would gradually withdraw its ground forces from Vietnam. As it was doing so, it would increase its training of the armed forces of the South Vietnamese government, or a government known as the Republic of Vietnam government. And at the same time, the Americans would maintain or even escalate the air war in Vietnam. And Nixon's goal with this was to increase the casualty count for Americans, because he believed that the reason there was so much hostility in the United States to the Vietnam War was because Americans were dying. Not because Vietnamese were dying, but rather because Americans were dying. And so his plan was to bring out of the country those Americans that were most likely to be killed there, which was the ground forces. Pilots were shot down on occasion, but this was far more infrequent than it was to see casualties on the ground. And so that was Nixon's great plan. He justified this both strategically, but also, and this was, I think, unusual for Richard Nixon, on humanitarian grounds. And what I mean by justifying, let me just step back a moment, sorry. What he was justifying was the continued U.S. involvement in Vietnam, not withdrawing the country immediately from the war, but switching gears and trying to fight the war in a different way using South Vietnamese troops. And he justified that, again, both strategically, but then also on humanitarian grounds. And what I mean by that latter thing, I think is quite interesting. I could go deep into the weeds on this, but I won't do so. But he cited something that became known as the Bloodbath Theory, which is something I think it's important for us to be thinking about as we conceive of U.S. foreign policy in the decades since then. What Nixon meant by that is that the United States had a moral obligation to stay in Vietnam, even as the Americans were responsible for widespread atrocities in the country. And these were atrocities that couldn't be denied. They were well publicized. American bombing was killing tens of thousands of Vietnamese. It was emptying the countryside of people as Vietnamese people were fleeing to the cities. This was well reported and undeniable. But Nixon said, we have to consider what would happen if the United States pulled out of the country. If that were to happen, he argued, there would be a bloodbath of Vietnamese friendly to the United States or supportive of the United States that would be far worse than what we're seeing in Vietnam now. And this was an interesting reversal of the war's moral calculus, so that it made those who were arguing in favor of continued war look as if they were taking the moral high ground, whereas those who were calling for the United States to withdraw from the war were in fact calling for widespread atrocities against Vietnamese people. Now, did Nixon believe any of this? I don't think so. But it was an effective argument. It was at the tail end of that speech in which Nixon laid out this agenda that he called for the support of those that are referred to as the great silent majority of my fellow Americans. And about a third of the country had tuned into this speech, about 72 million people, and its population of just over 200 million at that point. And in the days that followed this speech, 400,000 letters, postcards, telegrams came pouring into the White House, many of them with some sort of variation of, you know, I can no longer be silent. I am standing up for the United States and for my president. And so this obviously resonated with the people who heard this. Now, who were these people, the silent majority? And were they in fact a majority? The answer to that latter question is probably not. But Nixon was quite brilliant as a political tactician in suggesting to Americans, those Americans who were inclined to support U.S. policy, that they were in fact most Americans. These were those that are referred to as the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators in America's heartland. Those are terms that he used at the Republican National Convention when he was nominated as the Republican candidate. These were the people that he suggested represented the majority of the public, but they were being drowned out, they were being silenced by this vocal minority taking to the streets in opposition to the war. And in this way, Nixon was able to successfully build on some of the political divisions and cultural divisions in the country to infuriate those folks who felt that indeed their views were not being represented on the nightly news or in the nation's papers, and inspire them to mobilize in favor of the Nixon administration and against the administration's opponents. These were folks who felt furious for a number of different reasons. These were almost exclusively white Americans, not entirely, but almost exclusively, in some ways very similar to the base for Donald Trump today, who felt that the political values that they held dear in viewing the United States as a force for good around the world were coming into question, as you had young people, intellectuals, and others challenging U.S. foreign policy, identifying the United States as an imperial power in Southeast Asia. These were people who felt threatened by the civil rights gains that they saw in the 1960s, as neighborhoods were potentially becoming integrated, as schools were potentially becoming integrated. This was a threat to what they believed ought to be their way of life, that they ought to be able to retain their neighborhoods and their schools in the ways that had always worked for them. And of course, they often did not justify their desire to maintain segregated institutions on racist grounds, but often employed sort of economic logic, that integrated neighborhoods would lead to a decrease in property values, for example. And so in order to maintain our property values, we have to maintain the racial status quo. And similar things were going on with the schools. The education offered to their students would decline with the integration of these institutions. And therefore, so that their kids wouldn't suffer, it was important that they maintain their neighborhood schools. They not allow busing into schools, nor should they see their own children bust out to other schools in order to integrate those. And Nixon succeeded brilliantly in mobilizing this population, using not just this idea of the silent majority, but often coded language, this sort of idea of dog whistle politics, to appeal to them. Nixon in 1968 ran very strongly on a platform that he identified as a law and order platform. And law and order is one of these dog whistle terms that means different things to different people, but certainly to whites worried about an increase in crime, which they associated in part because Nixon made this fairly explicit with civil rights movement and racial unrest in the United States, so that they identified that with African Americans. It meant cracking down on young people who were demonstrating at the nation's campuses. Again, this was a challenge to the foreign policy views, the idea of the United States as an exceptional nation that many white Americans held. It also was infuriating, those campus demonstrations, to many who identified themselves as part of this silent majority, because these were young people who were often attending subsidized institutions. This was when public higher education was still fairly public, not privatized public universities that we see today. So these subsidized institutions, subsidized by the tax dollars of these hardworking Americans, who saw students attending these institutions attempting to tear them down or challenge the United States and all that it stood for. And this infuriated these people, particularly as they identified them not as working class people seeking an education, but these snot-nosed brats who were wealthy liberals who were attempting to tear down the nation. And Nixon certainly fed those ideas. Of course, many of these young people were themselves who were taking to the streets, demonstrating against the war, came out of working class communities, lower middle class communities. I mean, places like Kent State University, which became very well known because of the shootings that happened there following the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. These were not bastions of the rich. These were institutions that served working class and middle class communities, as did state universities across the country where we saw large numbers of demonstrations. So Nixon was able to successfully exploit these divisions, political, cultural, that were brewing in the United States by the late 1960s, and achieve political success in doing so. And this became a template that other political figures would use in later years. After Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, some of you might be aware, when he opened his general election campaign for president in 1980, he did so at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi. This was right next to where 3 civil rights activists had been murdered in 1964 during what was called Freedom Summer. Andrew Schwermer, James Chaney, or Michael Schwermer, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. And Reagan was told by the person who invited him, the Republican official who invited him, that these were what he called George Wallace-inclined voters. And Reagan gave a speech at the fair in which he said he supports states' rights. Another one of these coded words that's meant to signal to a white public that he's with them, that he stands with their values rather than the values of integration, civil rights, and so on. Reagan, we learned recently, some of you might have read about this over the summer, the National Archives released the transcript of a recording that Reagan made with Richard Nixon, in which he identified some African delegates at the United Nations General Assembly as monkeys and said they were still getting comfortable wearing shoes. And so Reagan had always been able to disassociate himself. He maintained a degree of plausible deniability that he was pursuing race-based policies, and we now have some revealing insights on what Reagan in fact thought about people of color. So after Reagan, we had George H.W. Bush, who in 1988, running for president against Michael Dukakis, drew on, again, a very racially tinged campaign. This was the William Horton issue. Some of you might remember the Republicans referred to him as Willie Horton. They thought it sounded more sinister than William Horton. He didn't refer to himself as that. But Horton was a prisoner who was in prison for murder, was released on a furlough, and while out on furlough had murdered a man and raped his wife. And this was in Massachusetts. And Bush's opponent in 1988 was Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And Dukakis, in fact, Dukakis was hammered by the Bush campaign because he had vetoed a measure that would have annulled this program. And so the Bush campaign hit him hard on this, not revealing, of course, that this is a program that was in fact founded by a Republican even earlier. But this campaign worked. The Bush folks hit Dukakis on the Horton issue, and as one Bush aide put it, this was the perfect blend of liberalism and a big black rapist. And And Bush saw his numbers jump 10 points against Michael Dukakis in the wake of this advertising campaign that was intended to hit Dukakis. This has not been an exclusively Republican thing. In 1992, Bill Clinton, in running for president, some of you may remember this as well, took a break from campaigning in New Hampshire to return to Arkansas to oversee the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, who was an African-American death row convict who was seriously mentally impaired. He had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head that a doctor referred to as a classic prefrontal lobotomy. I mean, he was so mentally impaired that during his last supper, before he was taken to the execution chamber, he didn't eat his dessert. He said he wanted to save it for later. Of course, when you're facing the needle, there is no later. Clinton also railed during that campaign against Jesse Jackson, against Sister Souljah, both African Americans, one a hip-hop artist, the other, of course, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a well-known civil rights figure who also had been a presidential candidate at one point. You know, the racially tinged nature of this was quite evident. As one electrician put it in Philadelphia when he was interviewed about Clinton going after Jesse Jackson, he said, "The day he went after that fucking Jesse Jackson is the day he earned my vote," right? And so this was very clearly a racially inspired thing. There's more I could say, but I think Peter wanted to keep us to about 15 minutes or so. That'll get us up toward Donald Trump, but maybe I'll hold off on that and return to that during our discussion in a bit.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that was great, and I'll just sort of amplify a little bit around the edges of what Scott talked about, because I think there are a couple of themes that you raised that are really important and point us, you know, I mean, our goal here today is to just point us to the present and how did we end up in the mess we're in. And so in my own work, the kind of pairing of our two projects is a book that came out fairly recently called Fortress America, and the subtitle sort of gives away the punchline, which is how we embraced fear and abandoned democracy. And I think the abandonment of democracy started before Nixon. Nixon pushed it forward, and here we are I think we're in the death throes of democracy, unless something breathes some new life into it in this country. So my own work begins in the early years of the post-World War II era, and sort of starts with the messages of the Cold War that broadly, just sort of broad sweep that, you know, American individualism, capitalism, and the American way of life rests on, you know, a private life that is connected to the political world that we live in, and that this privatization rests on virtuous citizens, individually doing what they should be doing to provide both national and personal security. And, you know, we can skip over civil defense, the atomic age, and all of that, and push into the 1960s, because I think Nixon is really sort of the capstone of the political transition that's happening in the 60s. And if we want to just sort of stay focused briefly on the political culture, we can see a lot in the elections of the 1960s. If we go to 1964, we still have a very strong holdover of atomic age fears, which Lyndon Johnson famously put front and center with the Daisy Girl ad that some of you may have seen, the little girl who's pulling daisy petals, and then the atomic bomb goes off, and we hear Johnson's very distinctive voice. He didn't have to say, "I'm Lyndon Johnson," because everyone knew how he sounded. You know, these are the stakes. We can either live together in peace or we must die. And that's what he said in this. And it was a very pointed response to Barry Goldwater's comments that he would not hesitate to use what they called tactical nuclear weapons, whatever that means, in a conflict. And so Johnson is really laying claim to an anti-nuclear position. Whether or not he or any of them ever really did anything major about that is another story. But he, these were still Cold War tropes. In his response, Barry Goldwater points towards Nixon's issues, where Nixon really is the one, as Scott pointed out, who pretty much coins the term law and order as a political mantra that sticks all the way through today. But Goldwater's ads in 1964 talked about street violence. Even though there was very little in 1964, the major uprisings in the cities really didn't start until 1965 and after, the first major one being the Watts uprising in 65. But there were a lot of them, but nonetheless, he pointed to very sort of, not subtly racialized violence in the streets. And he also talked about crime. But what he talked about when he talked about crime was organized crime. Up until that point, organized crime meant, crime bosses, meant, violent mafia-type organizations, not street crime. Street crime really was not an issue in 1964 in the campaign. Crime, yes. War and weaponry, yes. Social chaos, yes, for sure. And Goldwater really plays hard on that, but it doesn't get him very far. He's really trounced in the election. By 1968, we begin to see some very interesting things in that election. One of them is, of course, as Scott pointed out, Nixon laying claim to law and order. And he does this in his ads. And they're very explicit. There's a lot about social chaos. There's a lot about coded language for race. George Wallace, the language is not coded. It's very blatantly racist. And what we begin to see is this sense that it's a very, very dangerous world out there. And these are the things that both Nixon and Wallace are saying in 1968. No more of this, well, there are these crime rings that we have to crack because, the gangsters are, sort of the bad guys. And, in one of Goldwater's ads in 64, he names Billy Saul Estes. Probably not a name that many of you, well, some of you may remember, but, a big crime figure. Somebody like maybe Whitey Bulger would be known today, sort of similar. But, not so much street crime. We get to 68, and we have these very racist ads of George Wallace about how dangerous it is for women to walk down their streets at night. And really not at all subtle about women being vulnerable to violence. And then an immediate clip is to a school bus, So you go from the danger of the woman walking in her neighborhood at night to the danger of white children being bused out of their neighborhoods to go to school with black kids. And so these are the tropes. But what's really interesting also about this election, and we were talking about it a little earlier, is Humphrey is the Democratic candidate. And for those of us old enough to remember that campaign, he was completely tainted by the Vietnam War, and that was sort of the big issue. He carried the legacy of Johnson's war. But there were other things, interestingly, if you go back and look at some of these advertisements and his speeches, Humphrey gave what I would call a New Deal gloss to his campaign. So in answer to the fear-mongering about evil criminals and the race baiting that was going on with both Nixon and Wallace, Humphrey said, if we want to get a handle on crime, we have to build more schools. We have to provide better housing. We have to take care of our citizens. I mean, it was a classic New Deal message. And it was really not about, evil criminals, but about, we need to build a better society. If we don't build a better society, then we're going to be stuck with crime and with disruption and with violence. But if we build a better society, and that was the words that he used, through, basically government programs, New Deal type programs, then, we will prosper as a nation. That was the last even vaguely New Deal message by any candidate for president of a major party since. Not one ever after. That was it. That was Humphrey. And of course he was roundly defeated, not probably because of that, more because of the war and because of, Nixon's claims. But he really came out with, it might be too strong to call it a social justice message. We might see elements of what we would now call social justice, but it was definitely a New Deal message. That ends. And by 1972, when we have George McGovern running for president on the Democratic ticket, known to be one of the most left-leaning candidates we've ever had in the Democratic Party, but he had jumped on the law and order bandwagon fiercely. And the message that was part of Humphrey's campaign disappeared. It wasn't even really highlighted during the campaign because the war was the issue. The war was the issue, and Nixon was the peace candidate. Going to end the war with honor. We're going to end the war with honor. Now, it's interesting, and Scott sort of took us on a quick gallop forward looking at some of these campaigns, and it's so interesting, especially if we look at people like Ronald Reagan. Anybody guess what another one of Ronald Reagan's mantras during his campaign in 1980? Take a guess. Take a guess, a wild guess. Make America great again. That was Ronald Reagan. With, a lot of the very same kind of connotations that are true today, right? And if we look at those really horrible race-baiting ads that Scott described in the Bush campaign with the so-called Willie Horton ad, what do you think Dukakis did in response, the Democratic candidate? Did he call him out on his race-baiting? No. He made, well, yeah, that, but he also did an answer, which was his own race-baiting ad, where he had, where instead of Horton, he had a Latino who had been let out of a federal prison and had raped and murdered a pregnant woman, and yeah. So, I mean, it was exactly the same, and it was the same charge. So here you have, the Democrats trying to outdo the Republicans on the law and order theme, and nobody standing up for any of the kind of principles that went out the window after Humphrey's campaign. So, all of these things are a long path. Sometimes people think it was sort of 9/11 that kind of turned things around and pointed us to where we are today. 9/11 was just a blip on the screen. This trajectory started in the early years of the Cold War with messages about how you can't count on the government, you can't even trust the government. Pretty soon the government becomes an enemy, not just ineffectual, but actually damaging, and then we end up where we are with a president who has never spent even 1 minute in any kind of public service. So, I think, these converging forces bring us into the Trump era. They have a long backstory. I think that Nixon is probably the closest to a precursor of Trump that we've had. I mean, yeah, we can look at political styles and political positions, but the lying, the tarring and feathering of political opponents by, name calling, I mean, he was a master at that. He red baited long before he ran for president. He was red baiting opponents in California and red baiting successfully, strong progressive Democratic candidates. and just wiping them off the map by calling them names, calling them red, calling them communists. It didn't matter that they were lies, And so over time, lying just becomes part of the political culture and of where we are, So I think maybe I should stop there too, because I'm sure all of you have a lot to contribute to this conversation about how the hell did we end up where we are.
So I want to jump in. First, I want to mention that while we're thinking about 50th anniversaries and how these things are connected, and that next Friday night here, we will be marking the 50th anniversary of the separation of Bobby Seale from the Chicago conspiracy trial with music. And there's a very creative electronic music composer who has put together a piece of music that will include sampling from an LP that he found of Bobby Seale's speeches. And so we will be engaging that next Friday night here. And I think that also fits quite well with both what Scott and Elaine are saying. I want to push a little bit more, and one an added factor. And a little bit more is what Elaine is calling New Deal politics, and that I want to suggest that we might think about, or maybe you guys would respond to, 68 to 72 is kind of the death knell of Keynesian economics,
Right.
And we get to the early 70s and we hear that this mysterious thing called the Phillips curve has shifted. We see the fiscal crisis of New York. We have mortgage rates of 20%. And with hindsight from the early Reagan years, we can look back and say neoliberalism begins to become dominant in the mid-70s. So at a macroeconomic level, how is the shift from Keynesianism to neoliberalism also part of, I think, what you're both talking about? And I think that's embedded, especially in what Elaine is saying, but I'd like to tease out a little more of that. And then I'd like to raise a question that you really haven't raised explicitly, which is that along with the crisis of whiteness or this growing racism, what about the crisis of masculinity? And how is masculinity part and parcel? And I think when we look at the buffoon, in the White House and the things that he has claimed that he's done and the kind of masculinity that he struts around with, and so, and in some ways I think that the crisis of masculinity, it's a crisis especially of white masculinity that then is threatened by the rise of blackness as a legitimate way of being. And I also see it as linked to the end of Keynesianism, because part of that masculinity is the ability to provide for your family. And so it was interesting, this either late last week or early this week, there was this very interesting piece in the New York Times about how the children of immigrants have typically done better economically than the children of native-born Americans. And there's a way that, there's data, but there's also how you interpret the data. And I think it can be seen as partially explaining the rise of xenophobia, as again, and as Elaine said at the title of the book, about fear. And so the fear about the insecurity of whiteness, the fear about the insecurity of masculinity, the fear about the instability of the economy, how all of those things become embodied in the braggadocio of the guy in the White House who doesn't says that he's not afraid of anything, and obviously wouldn't die cowering like a dog in a tunnel. So I wonder if that gives you anything in addition to say, and then I'm going to get out of the way and
Yes. Certainly Keynesian economics, goes down the drain, and I think this whole privatization, individuals are responsible not only for their own safety and security, but for their own, economic well-being, and that means men.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's happening in the end of the 60s, you're getting a lot more women out of the home working, a challenge to the kind of basic breadwinner identity that had attached to manhood. You're also getting, and you mentioned this, you're getting the shift from civil rights to black power, and a really strong, visible presence of militant black men in the new phase of the anti-racist movement is black power, and those men are not cowering. They are not they are not wimps, and this is a time when white men are seeing white women going into the paid labor force. Black women had always been there, so that wasn't an issue, a new issue. And then you get the rise of just more women, especially married women, entering the paid labor force. But you get the beginnings of the feminist movement, and that also puts men on the defensive. And so the crisis of masculinity is really a big issue. And then you get the industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Susan Faludi's book Stiff does a really, really good job of getting at that powerful sense of male insecurity. And if you haven't seen the book, I mean, it's really remarkable, because she goes to these areas where men who had held industrial jobs have lost their jobs, and they talk to her, and they really open to her, in ways that manhood used to kind of close the faucet on revealing your emotional, And I once asked her at some point after I read the book, and I said, how did you get these guys to talk to you? And she got celebrities to talk to her too, and she got men in the porn industry to talk to her. I mean, she got men who embodied masculinity in various ways in their work lives, and she said, well, they all kind of, I reminded them of their little sisters, and I mean, Susan Faludi I always thought of as this fire-breathing, ferocious, larger-than-life feminist, which she definitely is on paper. But she's a very soft-spoken, diminutive person, and they didn't see her as threatening. And they opened up to her. And I think this book says a lot about the crisis of, not just the crisis of masculinity, but what's going on in the economy. Because you do have, very drastic impact of the industrialization, and then you get into the 70s, and the bottom falls out. So,
Yeah.
your turn.
Thank you.
Well, you handled that really well, so I won't go beyond that. But I will, because I'm a historian of U.S. foreign relations, I will add a different sort of masculine spin to this, which is that, at the same time that this is happening, the United States is losing the war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And this introduces a real crisis of, the masculine identity of the nation. America doesn't lose wars. We celebrate a victory culture. And so for the United States to lose this war, which by 1975 it had, instilled a tremendous crisis within the nation that a number of political figures, probably most effectively Ronald Reagan, were able to exploit. That the United States had become weak, that it needed to be remasculinized. There's a great book out there called The Remasculinization of America. I'm spacing on the author's name right now. Feminist scholar, I can't remember her name, but really fantastic book. And the basic idea was that by the late 1970s, policymakers thought that the United States now was projecting a a vision of weakness around the world, and it was essential for the United States to restore its strength, project that image of strength around the world, and demonstrate to other nations that America wasn't going to be pushed around. And so what we see with Ronald Reagan is his call for a re-escalation of the Cold War during his first term, certainly. The push for intervention in a number of places, especially in Central America, which became quite a hotspot in the 1980s. Ultimately, there's that invasion of Grenada, although, that didn't work the way I think Reagan had hoped. No one felt that, attacking the world's leading exporter of nutmeg really projected the image of strength that was hoped for. So there was something comparable on the national level happening to what we were seeing with that shift in the economy and the workforce in the early 1970s.
Great. So why don't we open this up and for questions, comments? Please keep speeches to a minimum, but Ward?
My name's Ward, and my question relates to how you characterize, Scott, how you characterize Richard Nixon as a brilliant tactician or a political strategist. And I got that back in the 70s when I was in school. It was something that everybody was talking about in school, actually. Brilliance versus criminal intent, brilliant criminal, right? How would you characterize Nixon as being brilliant in anything to our current president, who I think just seems to get by on the bravado of his not brilliant personality?
Yeah, and so, by the way, I should clarify. When I talk about Nixon as a brilliant tactician, I'm not saying that in an approving way, right?
No, right.
That but what he did worked. That's really what I meant. That
I am not opposed.
Right. That he understood that. But that he understood that inflaming the political and cultural divisions that existed in the United States by the late 1960s, early 1970s was a winning strategy. He barely eked out a victory in 1968. I think he ended up with, 43.5% of the vote. Humphrey was 42.7%, I believe, less than 1% victory. And then Wallace was about 13.5%, captured 5 southern states. Had Wallace not been in there, I think Nixon would have had a much more resounding victory. But Wallace was able to sap much of that white, right-wing, particularly Southern vote that Nixon was hoping to win. By 1972, he trounces McGovern in a landslide, and so he did tap into a winning strategy. Donald Trump is, I'm reluctant. He's certainly not a very stable genius, but he has figured out that anger works, and most Americans disapprove of Donald Trump. Right? But it doesn't really matter what most Americans think, because not all Americans vote. And so he's been able to tap into and secure the support of a minority of Americans, but a minority that's heavily animated by the current political moment, and to shore up that support by employing some of those same sort of Nixonian tactics, smearing your opponents, talking about conspiracies to take down the president, using law and order language. Just 2 weeks ago, his campaign said, the silent majority is out to win again. He understands Nixon's playbook, and he's been employing that. I don't think he's nearly as intelligent as Nixon was. And I should point out here, Nixon and Trump have a lot in common, but there are a number of things that distinguish them. Nixon was in fact able to win a number of things as president that might surprise people who don't know much about his record. It was under Nixon that we saw the creation of the EPA, for example. We saw the creation of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Nixon was distrusted by movement conservatives, by the movement right. They saw him as, in many ways, a liberal figure. The folks who rallied around Barry Goldwater in 1964 did not necessarily rally around Richard Nixon in 1968. He was able to bring them on board, but these were not true believers in Nixon. With Trump, I get the sense these are true believers when it comes to Trump. He can say just about anything or do just about anything, and people do stick with him. They see him as their guy. I don't know that that's reflective of any sort of political brilliance on Donald Trump's part, but certainly he is out there speaking a language that they understand. We find it crude, distasteful. His mendacity seems to know no bounds. Like the Washington Post keeps track of how many times he's lied, and I think they're up to about 13,000 times now since he's been in office. I should say lied or misled. They're not always the same thing. It seems not to make a huge difference. But he is, he's been quite effective so far in at least keeping the Republicans on board. Day by day we're seeing questions about whether that's going to continue, with the impeachment inquiry that's happening, and we get these reports of, Republicans in Congress, what they really think of Donald Trump, but of course they can't say anything publicly because they're worried about a primary challenge on their right, or Trump tweeting out his disfavor of them and what that might mean for them in a general election. What he's done is worked so far, but I don't see it as calculated as Richard Nixon. I think he's been more serendipitous at this point.
And of course, Nixon and Trump all had advisors.
They did. I'm not sure that. Well, there's been a lot written about Trump and his advisors who seem to come and go. I don't know to what extent he's actually listening to his advisors. Nixon, I think, probably listened to his advisors much more. And they seem to feed or reinforce his desire to pursue those divisive politics. I'm not suggesting that Trump's advisors don't want to pursue those divisive politics, but Trump seems to operate based on his own instincts and doesn't seem to pay much attention to what advisors might be telling him.
I think it's also really important just to mention that, when we think about the 2016 election, who really did elect Donald Trump? It was it was the people that didn't vote. Hillary Clinton won about 23 and something % of the votes of the voting public, the eligible voters. Okay, not the votes cast. Eligible voters. That doesn't include people who were disfranchised for all kinds of unfair reasons. But of the eligible voters, she won 23 and some odd %. Trump won 22 and some odd %. And 43 and some odd % people who were eligible to vote did not vote. And they were the ones basically who we can thank for the outcome.
I think that further about idealists, especially young people that were strong Bernie supporters. I was for Bernie right away. I jumped over to Hillary because I called heck for Hillary, but after I Bernie from a nurse that they wanted that pure Medicare, and they're messing with that now with this advantage stuff. But anyways, when that congresswoman from Florida, I can't remember her name, was on the commissioner committee, she messing with the debate pattern and stuff. Just imagine if they were to do what the Republicans are doing in the primaries now, where they're eliminating opponents to Trump in Minnesota and other states. And I did have a question. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Now, my father and mother grew up under Hoover, and they had a really rough on the farm, but they had enough food, but nothing else. In the city, people were hungry. So people don't remember that. I guess they call it the Great Spaghetti. So my father always said, well, there's too much money at the top, and the people at the bottom, there's masses of people at the bottom, they're millionaires selling apples, he said. You have a depression, and Obama saved us from a real bad one time last time with all the help from the Republicans. And that's where we are now, except we do have some government. We have Social Security and Medicare, and they would like to take that away. What do you expect coming up in our economic? If we're going to have a big catastrophe.
Yeah, thanks. You know, historians, it's usually best when we just stick to the past rather than predict the future. I don't know. I mean, there are indications that things are starting to turn south, but you know, we'll see. I think it is important that when Donald Trump ran for president in 2016, he didn't run on a platform of dismantling Social Security and Medicare. He, in fact, said he's going to protect those things. And so, you know, what Trump says is one thing. What he does is another. The people who voted for him, I think, voted for him with the expectation that he was going to champion those. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
It's Medicare Advantage, just the insurance companies, and they're not regulated like the former
Insurance companies.
Right. Yep. No, that's right. So, you know, where this is going to go, I'm not sure. You know, I mean, the Republican Party has been quite clear that it wants to go after these programs, Social Security, Medicare, and they do so under the, you know, the guise of deficit reduction. Of course, they also enacted that tax cut that drove up the deficits. So it's, you know, where it's going to go, I think that's up to all of us.
Elaine, did you want to?
No, we have a few people on this
Great,
side.
go ahead.
All right. I just, I mean, there was a comment about that 23% of people voted for Hillary among the eligible electorate, and 22 voted for Trump, and 45 didn't vote. But we also had pointed out that our last real progressive candidate was in 1968. So what are we to make of the people not voting and the opportunity to possibly attract voters by actually presenting something rather than doing dog whistle politics and Democrats trying to out Republicans? Are these things connected?
Yeah. Should we take the other questions?
Oh, good. All right, listen, Leif.
I'm interested in what y'all think about, on the left, if you will, identity politics and the role that has played in our political culture.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that, you know, as you pointed out, is the country is deindustrialized, union workers lost their jobs, factory jobs. And I have to be honest and say, when I look at the election, if I was a white working class family, I don't hear myself in what Hillary Clinton or a lot of Democrats, I don't see myself in their story. Mm-hmm. And it's like as the white working class moved to the Republican Party, the Democrats said, well, let's cobble together what we can with, you know, what we call identity politics. A lot of very progressive things, no doubt. But it ain't a winner. Mm-hmm. Or I'm not sure it's a winner. And so I'm wondering what you think about the rise of, quote, identity politics in the culture.
Good. Let's get one more on the table, please.
One, right?
Oh, okay.
Okay. My question is, as you've been talking about since Nixon, fear has been the issue for them, a winning issue for them. Mm-hmm. So can't we, once we realize that fear is always a winning issue, can the progressives or the Democrats use fear of healthcare, economic strife to win? I mean, evidently, we thought there was all the races were all taken care of when Obama won, but we found out different. So we need to get completely away from that level and go after the fear issues that the Republicans tout. Is that feasible?
So they're not going to let you guys be historians.
There's a historical answer to that, but
I wanted to thank you for your historical summary because it was really helpful to see some of the parallels and then the trajectory of from Nixon and even before to Trump. But the thing that your summary led me to wonder, and I wondered this many times, is it seems like there's an ongoing tension between capitalism and democracy. And from a historical perspective, it looks to me that democracy is just a tool in the hands of capitalists. Because the left keeps losing, and the left keeps, all the questions we're asking, you know, the strategies of the left, whether people get assassinated or whether the strategies of the left can't compete, whether we're talking about China taking over Hong Kong or whether we're talking about the scale of the virtue can't compete with the scale of capital, whether it's unions or whether it's, you know, so we have good intentions, but how, so that's what I gathered from your historical summary. That's kind of a question.
Well, you know, we've tossed around New Deal a little bit. FDR was quite explicit about how he wanted to use government programs to protect and reinvigorate capitalism. And that was his answer to every claim that he was a socialist. And he insisted that he was not. And he was not. Nowhere near. And he was right to say that his programs were aimed at, you know, shoring up capitalism at a time when capitalism was in deep trouble, right? You know, I mean, he's first elected, of course, in the Depression. So, you know, and it was at a time in the country, too, when capitalism wasn't very popular. You know, these were the years that a lot of progressive people were really drawn to the Soviet experiment. Because guess what? The Soviet Union did not experience the Great Depression. Duh, you know, they didn't have a capitalist system. So that's, I think, one thing about the tension between capitalism and democracy. It hasn't always, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be. But I think the questions about the Democratic Party are very well taken, because the Democratic Party has turned its back on itself. You know, the Democratic Party has self-imploded by identity politics, by giving up on its basic constituency of, you know, they throw around working families as a term, but they, you know, and I think that, you know, this election now, with the Democrats cannibalizing each other and just handing over, you know, meat and potatoes to Trump every day, I think it will be interesting to see how this campaign turns out, because, you know, we have one candidate whose you know, whose healthcare plan is radical, and where's that going to go? And you know, the Democrats don't stand for anything anymore, as far as I can tell. Maybe some of you see something, but you know, the old Democratic base, if you will. You know, it is, you know, what is the derogatory, you know, it's the East Coast, you know, latte drinking liberals, you know, elitists that are now.
Well, it's the feed intellectual snobs.
Thank you, like us.
Yes.
Here we are. Right. So, I mean, the Democrats, I don't know what they can draw on historically. I mean, you know, if we look at the way that the Northern Democratic Party, you know, took on civil rights and shifted the whole way in which the party system worked, and that was also a Humphrey era event. And you know, and really did have a constituency that was grounded in working class people, and you know, that's just gone. So I mean, I despair, frankly. I don't know, but again, we're not here to predict the future.
Yeah.
We need someone with a crystal ball.
Do you want to say?
You know, I live now in Duluth. I haven't been there very long, and Duluth is next to the Iron Range. And I've been very interested in watching the political transformation happening on the Iron Range, which is historically and traditionally been very democratic. These are working class communities, mining families. that have always identified with the Democratic Party, and our congressman now is a Republican, Pete Stauber. And that's it was a long time coming, but it was in 2016 with Donald Trump that I think, a significant number of, again, historically Democratic identifying voters began to look to the Republican Party because they looked at Hillary Clinton, whose husband Bill Clinton brought us NAFTA, and they didn't trust her. And they looked at Donald Trump, who may not have known what he was talking about, but at least spoke their language, that these trade deals have been a disaster, they've screwed the working class, and that was enough. That's something they weren't hearing from the Democrats running for national office. And so it wasn't in that election that Pete Stauber was elected, but Pete Stauber is a more working class union member Republican, one of the very few that's out there. And he was able to identify with those folks. And so we can see it here in, what for you all would be your backyards, but for me, I have to live with it.
Yes, please.
My name's Deborah. Elaine's comments about the Democratic Party and voting. So the assumption is about politics, both the parties and politicians are defined on what's going on in the economy, people's experiences in their lives. It would make sense of the Democratic Party's hard to define right now. Because as the Republicans became more conservative, either independents or who was a Democrat group, so the stretch of who has to be embraced has been hard to hold together in a cohesive way. And it feels like to overlook that, be to overlook, so I'm not sure. When I hear the phrase identity politics, I don't really know what it means. It's a phrase I hear a lot. But even in recent history, the Democrats won the presidency last time because voters of color believe there might be a candidate who really carried their interests. Can the Democrats win elections trying to be an old-style Democrat for a group of white working-class people who've moved their politics somewhere else? I don't think they can. And I do think that, so anyway, I think these issues of race, of xenophobia, have been baked into our history from the beginning, and we're living in another era where we've got to either resolve it or it'll continue to embroil us. So I do think there are a few things in this.
Oh, yeah. And just to give her a plug, my colleague Erica Lee in the history department at the Twin Cities campus has just written a book on xenophobia that's coming out in about a week.
Right.
And it promises to be really, really interesting.
I mean, I want to add, I think, an element that we haven't thought about. I mean, one is to think historically about the economy and the question of whether neoliberalism entered a crisis in 2008, 2009, that it has not come out of, and that some of the challenge in understanding this moment that we're living in is that whether is somebody actually advising Trump? Is there, besides staying in power, is there a strategy for how to get the capitalist economy growing again in the United States? And is that about privatizing Medicare and social? Is that actually a path to economic growth, or is it just a way to keep shifting wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top? And then I want to add to that, what we see going on in the world right now, whether it's what's happened in Chile in the last 2 weeks, what's been happening in Hong Kong, what's happened in Ecuador, what's happened in Lebanon, that it seems to me that the global system is stuck. And in some crisis points, people are exploding because It just is not working for them on a day-in, day-out basis. I think it's also connected to the rise of xenophobia in Great Britain, in Italy, in Hungary, you know, the rise of what we may too glibly or not call fascism, that both of those things are happening, and I think they're both responses to the stuckness of the global capitalist system. And I just don't know, are there ways to think about that help us think about the Iron Range or the east side of St. Paul or any of these specific places where we are? Is there a way, as they say, you know, to think globally and act locally? And what does it mean to think globally about all this? And I'm not sure, but I think, because I'm not going to let this end with Elaine promoting despair. I am not going to let people leave here in despair. So
My book doesn't end with despair. I had to not end it with despair. I had to find optimism. And it's in the resistance.
Democracy lives at the end.
Andy Dawkins.
Well, I think that what we've seen over the last 40, 50 years is the ascendancy of the corporate monopolization of our economy, and that you can trace it back in the bringing corporations back to being something that helps power a middle class, prospering middle class, and not having all the profits go to stockholders instead of the profits go to wages is the actual best thing that we can do. And we need to say it loud and long, and I think Elizabeth Warren's saying it pretty good.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, we just mentioned earlier that 40% of the people didn't vote.
Right.
And we know the solid Trump people are maybe, 20 or 30%? That means it seems like we get off the vote and we're win. Anybody agree with that or not?
Good luck convincing me to vote this year.
Pardon me?
Good luck convincing me to vote next year.
Okay.
Well, why not?
I despair in the political process. I don't despair in our ability to change the system. I just despair in putting our eggs into the political basket.
What basket should we put our eggs in?
Collectivization.
How do we do that?
Well, we need to start locally. I mean,
Without voting?
Let's not demonize the.
No, it's a question. No, it's
Yeah,
literally, I'm asking a political question.
yeah, without.
Without voting, how do we collectivize?
I think the voting is, it's like, to me, it's a vote is to send my energy out to some institution that I don't want it to be a part of. Like, I don't support what Democrats represent right now, and I certainly don't support what Republicans represent. But I don't really like being demonized for. Not demonized, but I'd be feeling that other people are demonizing me for not voting, and say that I'm part of the problem. It's like, well, show me something that I can get behind and I'll support it. But if I don't see anything to support it.
I'm interested in the strategy of social change, outside of the ballot box. That's why I asked the question. Because I do think you represent a lot of people who don't vote, but who are passionate about social change. And I'm interested in that because I don't fully understand how that works.
I'm trying to sort it out right now.
Fair enough. We're all trying to sort it out.
Question? Yes, please.
I wanted to hear more. You made a statement, I think I'm saying this right, those who didn't vote robbed us on Trump. Was that right?
Yeah, I think I said that.
Can you say any more about that?
I can piggyback on that.
Please.
We're going to have a little conversation about this. I'm genuinely curious as to I totally understand people not wanting to throw their vote behind something they don't believe in, but the reality of the situation is we live in this paradigm. Short of blowing the whole system up, which we are not capable of doing at this time, just dismantling our entire democracy or who knows what. Like, the reality is you're going to have one of two candidates be president, generally speaking. So, you could not vote, but, then you have zero power. The way I view it is even if I wasn't in favor of one candidate over another, in my opinion, outcome A or B is inevitable. And we have to pick A or B, you know, to have any say over the future. And when you end up with the worst of the two options, in my view of things, and you don't contribute to that process, then it's like, it could have at least been the better of two options, even if you didn't like either of the two options. Because for me, even if I weren't in favor of, you know, both of them, I would still choose the lesser of two evils, realizing that in my, like, the reality is you will have one of those two things regardless of whether you vote or not. So, I like the numbers of how people who don't vote cause the election, like, I definitely agree with that statement. One of those outcomes can happen.
There are other people who vote for it. Sometimes they're third parties. And people, I mean, what are we saying here?
Well, but so she's saying people that didn't vote at all. So they didn't vote for anything.
Oh, apparently not. If you don't vote for one of the two,
More people did not vote for voting than voted.
Yeah.
More people did not vote than voted.
oh, okay.
I think that we need to reform the electoral college and get the people in Wyoming have more of a say-so than the people in New York.
Well, there's one less person in New York now who's moved to Florida.
Red states that voted Trump in, actually, population-wise, I mean, she won with a majority of the vote, but not the states that it, so we have to fix that system.
So, any final comments from you guys? And no, well, if you need to express despair.
I'd like to say one thing. Your assessment, we got something today that I think is a grave threat. Fox News, the Rush Limbaugh, and the hate radio, and that scares me. And along with what they call fundamental Christianity, extreme religion. Any comments?
Spend more time here.
I'm from a foreign country, Minneapolis. I had a hard time finding it, but I want to go.
Now that you found
Thank
it.
you.
Now that you found it. Elaine and Scott, you want to just...
We'll see what happens. I mean, I think, you know, going back to my original comments, Richard Nixon and his story tells us a great deal about where we do find ourselves now, and that is history. You can't change that, but we do see similar sorts of things happening today, and those are things that we can change. You know, we do have the power to change those.
When you were doing your line from Nixon all the way through to Trump, you didn't discuss the Obama era and how that came about, how that fits into the picture. Can you summarize anything about that?
Well, the Obama phenomenon is an interesting one. Again, most people didn't vote, but we ended up with Barack Obama, who came to power having built a considerable coalition of people behind him. He was not a left-wing candidate. He was really sort of a centrist corporate Democrat. But I think he did inspire many people because he was an African American who might actually be elected president of the United States. I mean, he had other strengths as well, but I think symbolically that meant a lot to many people. It was significant in a nation like the United States with its history of slavery, racial segregation, discrimination and racism, all of these things that an African American might in fact be elected president. And I think that helped to mobilize the support for Obama. I know he also disappointed many people as president. And there were many people who I've seen interviewed in the press who talked about how they voted for Barack Obama and now they're voting for Donald Trump. that was a concern that I had when Obama was elected, that I think people had placed a great deal of faith in Obama as a significant agent of change. I didn't see any evidence for that at the time, and I think it disillusioned many people who expected more from his administration. And so when Donald Trump came along, the things he was saying responded to some of that frustration, and he was successful then in siphoning off some of that support that Obama had been able to win.
And Obama brought a lot of people to the polls who had not voted previously. You know, I mean, there are people who are principled non-voters, like yourself, and there are others who are just indifferent and don't show up. And Obama mobilized a lot of those folks, especially young people and people of color, and that contributed to his success. And he was, he was an extremely charismatic and appealing person on the campaign trail.
So, Elaine, you did bring some books.
Oh, just a couple in case anybody.
Yes, so there are some books. And Scott has a flyer at least for.
I did.
Which you can have for $27.99.
Yeah. I do have, if anybody is interested in the new book on the silent majority, I have a flyer that will give you 20% off.
Wow. Great, and thank you for coming. And I think it's, I get hope every time people come and take time out. You could be watching some horror movie on television or something on Saturday afternoon. So here we are, and I hope you've signed the guest book, and we'll stay in touch and come back. And there's lots happening just in the coming week. We have someone who led the fight in Arizona for ethnic studies will be here Monday, and as I said, this musical program around Bobby Seale and the Chicago conspiracy trial on Friday. Lots of things going on. Come back. Orso is always here to give some peace. Yes. Great. Can we show some love for the